All right, welcome in. It's the Breer Report mailbag for December the 5th. We are headed into week 14. I'm in Detroit, Michigan, or just outside Detroit, Michigan for Lions Packers. Tonight, big week 14 coming up. And of course, for some teams, it means something different. For some teams, you're talking about starting to head into coaching search season. You get the Jets, the Saints, the Bears already in that bucket. There will obviously be more. And then big games coming for teams like Green Bay and Detroit this weekend. As always, you can check out our longer form mailbag on the mmqb.com. I answer more questions there. I got a little more detail to the answers there, so be sure to check that out. But I am going to answer some questions here. And our first question comes from Jeff Butera. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Jeff. That's at BayNews9, Jeff on Twitter. Is Mike McDaniel a long-term answer in Miami, or are there concerns about toughness and preparation that might outweigh offensive ingenuity? Jeff, I understand this question has been asked a lot, and I understand why the question has been asked. I think you look at the trajectory of the Dolphins and where they've been over the last couple of years, and I still think they're in a very good place. Now, in a year or two, could there be a little bit of a roster reset where they have to move some pieces around? Tyreek Hill is older. Teron Armstead, their left tackle, has gotten older. Yeah, that exists. And there are questions, of course, lingering on whether or not Tua Tagovailoa can be the answer on the sort of contract that he's that he's got now. Now, that said, I think from a coaching standpoint, we've seen a team that's been very well coached. It's taken them a while to get the defense right, but I think we've seen good signs this year that Anthony Weaver's getting that right and bringing in a Raven style of defense. He's had 3 defensive coordinators in 3 years, of course. So I think just from a football standpoint, everything is pretty much where it needs to be. I think the things that you're talking about, like the ability to play in the cold, the ability to play to have a more physical run game. Again, I think that those are things you can inject into your program. And it's something that Mike McDaniel was a part of in San Francisco. If you look over the years, early on in San Francisco, they did more finesse zone type of run scheme. In recent years, you've seen more gap scheme stuff that San Francisco is doing. They've become one of the more physical teams in all of football. So while the Dolphins may not fit into that designation now, they might not be in that category now. Mike McDaniel has been part of transforming a team into that in the past. So I certainly think that that's, something that he's capable of doing. I don't think there are real limitations on where he can bring the team from a scheme standpoint because of, the amount of experience he has coaching on that side of the ball. And I think now that it looks like he's got the defense in the sort of place where he wants it to be, now you can start to build forward. Now, this stuff, of course, is subject to a lot of the same things that every team is subject to. How are you drafting going forward? How are you going to eventually find the replacement for Tyreek Hill? Can you make Jalen Waddle the focal point of an offense the way Hill's been the focal point of the offense the last couple of years? Can you draft more linemen? I think that's a fair question. What's going to happen with the offensive line over the next few years? So lots of fair questions about the Dolphins, but I don't look at any of them as questions that Mike McDaniel wouldn't be capable of answering as their head coach. So I think Mike McDaniel is the guy in Miami going forward. Obviously, they signed him to an extension, and I think he's positioned well to take what he's done over his first 3 years and create a 2.0 down the road too. My second question for the week. This is from Outside Zone Pod. That's at Outside Zone Pod. Is it a coincidence that Bryce Young and Anthony Richardson have looked better after getting benched, or is there something to glean here? Yeah, I think there are a couple things to glean. Outside Zone. I think the first thing is that we need to be careful about making sweeping judgments, myself included, about quarterbacks within the first 3 or 4 years of their career. We're seeing it with Baker Mayfield, with Sam Darnold, with Geno Smith, how, even really good quarterbacks can be kind of prisoners of their own circumstances early in their career. And it's very uncommon that you see a quarterback of that age overcome bad circumstances. Now let's look at Bryce Young's circumstances. He comes in, he's drafted by Frank Reich. He's drafted by general manager Scott Fitterer, who, is on his second coach. Midway through his rookie year, his coach gets fired. His GM gets fired at the end of his rookie year. So now you've flipped not only the offensive system going into year two, you flipped the coaching staff. You've got obviously the normal attrition and turnover on the roster. Bryce Young's already been through a lot as a young player. Anthony Richardson has not been through all of that, but here's a guy who was sort of dealing, I think, early in his career with that Trey Lance dichotomy. And I'm not saying he's going to become Trey Lance, but that Trey Lance dichotomy where he wasn't at points good enough for a coach to say, this is our roster's best option, but he needed the reps because he just hadn't played enough. Like Trey Lance, like the problem Trey Lance had in San Francisco was Trey Lance needed to play more, but he's playing for a contender. And Kyle Shanahan couldn't sacrifice single plays, series, games to the development of a quarterback when he had a roster full of players that were ready to contend in the here and the now. So where Trey Lance just needed to play and just needed to see more stuff and just needed to build up the library in his head of things that he had seen, the Niners weren't in a position to afford him that. The Colts ostensibly were, but like it gets to a point where it's like, can you still sell him to the roster if there's clearly a better option on the roster? And that's what Joe Flacco gave them earlier this year. So the coaching staff had to work through that, where Anthony Richardson had to earn his way back onto the field. And same thing goes for Bryce Young. Like I think for Dave Canales, as positive a person he is that, when you're in your first year, you have to create some accountability. And, you create that accountability in your program. And it's, like you can't have one standard for the quarterback and another standard for everybody else. So for different reasons, the benchings happen this year. I think it's an accountability thing in Carolina. And I think in Indianapolis is a little bit more of a, like, we need to give our veterans the best possible answer at the position. And right now it's not Anthony Richardson. And then I think when you go through that, then it becomes like, okay, like, can these guys earn their way back on the field? And both of them have. And so, like, I think where, we look at the normal trajectory, and again, I'm guilty of this. And you say to yourself, like, okay, like this is the generally when a guy loses his job, like as a young first round pick, who the team has invested a lot in, there's no going back. And generally when you give the guy the job the first time, you're not taking it back from him. Maybe the rules of engagement have changed a little bit on that. And I'm open to the idea of that, because I do think that, like the challenge in developing quarterbacks is different than it was 15 or 20 years ago. So, like, I think, what the benchings did was, I think in Bryce Young's case, the benching, showed the locker room that that Dave Canales was going to hold people accountable. I think in Indianapolis, the benching showed the veterans in that locker room that Shane Steichen was going to do everything he could to give them the best answer at the most important position on the field. And then in the end, like both those guys wind up earning their way back on the field and get some benefit out of it. So I don't know if Anthony Richardson or Bryce Young are going to be the quarterbacks of the Colts and the Panthers in 10 years. But what I do know is it does seem like they've taken some good from a tough circumstance, and maybe getting knocked down a little bit helped accelerate some things as far as their development goes. Our third question from Eric Klein, PhD. That's Dr. Eric Klein, our recurring guest of the show. Albert, are you aware of any college coaches who may have their eye in the NFL? I recall that Matt Campbell was a serious candidate for the Jets opening last time, and based on his success at Iowa State, do you think he might get interviews again this time around? Matt Campbell came very close to getting the Lions job 4 years ago. There was a connection with him and Chris Spielman. They're both from the same town in Ohio. And Matt Campbell was seen, I think, in almost a Brad Stevens type of way by NFL teams, where Brad Stevens, one of the things that made him attractive to the Celtics all those years ago was that he had found a way to win with lesser talent. He had taken developmental players and turned them into stars and turned them into NBA players. And so you saw the developmental piece of it. You saw the team building piece of it. And I think Matt Campbell has a lot of those things, as a coach, and has shown those things at Iowa State the same way Brad Stevens showed those things as a basketball coach at Butler. So, yes, I could see Matt Campbell getting looks again. I do think that there are some things about him that would be attractive again to NFL teams. I think the question is whether or not, you want to go down that road if you're an NFL team. Like some of the most recent examples, Matt Rule, Urban Meyer, have not worked. So, like, I think there's fair questions there as to whether or not whether or not that's the right way to go. And so I would say TBD on that. Like, but I think teams like, and I think the teams that have got the early start now, again, the Jets, the Saints, the Bears, like to me, those teams are the ones that might look at it because I think those are the teams that are going to have the time to take the biggest picture look at the field. And so would you look at Kirby Smart from Georgia, Ryan Day from Ohio State, Dan Lanning um, from Oregon? Those are probably some of the guys. Steve Sarkisian from Texas. Like those are some of the guys that probably, with some NFL experience or connections to NFL programs might translate the best to the NFL. But there's not like a glaring obvious one. I think Campbell would have some interest in the league if the league came knocking again. But I don't think that there's a big obvious one out there the way like Matt Rule was 5 years ago. Appreciate you guys coming out. As always, again, check out the print mailbag. You can go to the mmqb.com. It's up there now. Got a lot more answers to a lot more questions. Keep sending these questions in. If you guys want to participate in the mailbag from a video standpoint, you want to see your face on here, you can always send your questions to BreerSImailbag@gmail.com. Appreciate you guys coming out. We'll have another Breer Report for you on Friday morning.